I want to talk to you about doubt, because that's the question I get most often from teaching college students. And it's a theme I've heard this morning already from Barbara Brown Taylor and others. And I want to be just sort of blunt with you at the beginning here, and I really mean this. Belief has always been difficult for me. And I mean just really difficult. It's not an easy thing. I don't just lightly take faith. There are a lot of reasons for that. One reason is because, faith is sort of like an emotional intimacy thing, and I'm an American male, and I don't have an emotional life to speak of, so I don't really know how to do that very well. But part of it is also it's the intellectual content. I hate to put it that way, but we all, I think, have issues with our faith that make it difficult to hold on to, and doubt just sort of happens. And, I went to seminary for 4 years. And then I went and, I did doctoral work for 5 years and wrote a dissertation. And I did that not for vocational reasons. I did it because I just had to know stuff. And I didn't want to just fly through this faith without having that issue. See, that's just the way I'm wired, right? And that's why I teach. I do these kinds of things. I write books. I just have to keep journaling almost publicly to try to process my own faith. Now, I know people, maybe I don't think too many of you are like this, because you probably wouldn't be here if that were the case, but I know people who never have a question. They never have a problem, and I'm like, an avalanche destroys a village. Anything? Any reaction there? No. How about human trafficking? Where's God when you need him here? How about children being kidnapped? How about people just dying at a young age? I hate people like that have no questions whatsoever, for heaven's sake. All you have to do is be awake and to process reality. And you're going to have doubts. We're all going to have doubts. I have them. And you know what? You don't have to be a deep thinker. You don't have to go to seminary or college or anything like that. You just have to be aware. When my son, who's now 31 years old, when he was 6, for whatever reason, I was reading the Garden of Eden story to him. I don't know why. I would not do that today to a 6-year-old, but I did it anyway, because I'm supposed to, I guess. We're going in order. I got to hit Genesis. So I was reading the story, and, the serpent's talking to Eve, and my son, who's 6, goes, so I kept reading, and he goes, so I ignored him again. I kept reading, and he goes, I said, Eric, what's going on? What's wrong? And he says, Dad, animals can't talk. And I felt like saying, Eric, not so loud, he might hear you. Don't say that. You see, I wasn't in tuned to an honest question that a young boy was asking, because let's face it, folks, he's having a form of a faith crisis at the age of 6 and doubting something, because he's always been taught, why did we go to this church? Long story. Anyway, the Bible is true and everything it says, and it's historical and it's factual. That's sort of a basic property of the Bible. And he said, Dad, Winnie the Pooh talks. Saturday morning cartoons, those animals talk. Is this the same thing? What I wish I had the presence of mind to say is, you're right, animals don't talk. And I'll bet you something, Eric, ancient Israelites knew that. This might be a clue that this is a story, and not something, let's say, factual or historical. But you see, he's a kid minding his own business, listening to his dad, reading the Bible to him, and that's enough to trigger something in him. Or my daughter, Liz, if any of you have read has anybody read The Sin of Certainty here? Who's bought it? That's really all I care about. That's good. Okay, fantastic. But I mentioned my daughter, Liz, in that book, but when she was 10 years old, she now has give us a granddaughter, which is really cool. And I just found out literally 10 minutes ago they're having another one, and it's a boy. I didn't do anything directly. Just don't cheer me. It's really nice. Anyway, and if you know me, if you follow me on social media, I post pictures every 45 minutes of my granddaughter. But anyway, so she was 10 years old, and she came home from church one day, despondent, not angry, just sad. I said, Liz, what's going on? And she said, Dad, all those Egyptian soldiers that died in the Red Sea, aren't they God's children too? And I still can't recount that without feeling something deep inside. I didn't really have a good answer for her, but inside I was saying, you go, girl. You know, you hold on to that instinct. But she was doubting something about God at that moment simply from being told a Bible story. Or my youngest daughter, Sophie, she's 26 now. When she was 16, I, as I always did, woke her up on a Sunday morning to go to church, and she just sat up and looked at me and she said, I'm not going. Why not? Because I just don't believe that stuff anymore. I said, well, you're going anyway. And she said, no, I'm not. And she won that. But I knew I had to let her go then too. See, she had, through a process of experiences, some very personal, some less so, had come to a point where she doubted this thing that she was raised in. And I'll tell you one thing, and this connects very much with what Barbara was just talking about. She attended a school with a very large Jewish population, and she went to bat mitzvahs and bar mitzvahs. And she asked me once after one of those, Dad, I just can't believe they're going to hell. And I said, neither can I. And I don't. But she'd been taught a certain way. See, she's just paying attention to reality, to the world around her, as all my kids were, and it happens. It's not weird that you have causes to doubt things about your faith. Like I just said, I struggle all the time. You know the thing that gets to me, speaking of small things that get to you, here's the thing that gets to me as much as anything, the universe. Namely, its size. You know, okay, the speed of light, 186,000 miles per second. That is going around the circumference of the Earth 7.5 times in 1 second. Or, if you will, going from New York to Los Angeles and back again about 38 times in 1 second. You keep that up for about 4 years and 4 months, that back and forth, you keep that up. Not 1 second, not for 1 minute, not for 1 hour, not for 1 day, not for a week, for 4.5 years almost. You'll get to the nearest star in our galaxy. And if you keep it up for about 2.5 million years, you'll reach the next galaxy. So what? That freaks me out. You know, King David, the heavens declare the glory of God. No, they freak me the hell out sometimes. Because here's, you know, 100 billion stars in our galaxy. Hundreds of billions of stars. You know this. Hundreds of billions of stars, hundreds of billions of galaxies. And you'd think with all that stuff, things would be pretty full out there, but scientists are telling us that 96% of our universe are something called dark energy and dark matter, which I think as scientists talk for, we don't know what the hell is going on out there. It's just a big thing that it gets bigger. See, then the question is, where is God? Are the hairs of your head numbered? Really? Where is this God? God is everywhere. Okay, that's an easy thing to say when you have a dome over your world and you have a small sort of world that you live in and maybe a solar system with lamps hanging up in the sky that we now call stars. Where is this God? Is this God looking down on us? What do we mean when we say God? That's a pretty fundamental question. Or to nerd out a little bit even more, evolution is a big issue for me. Not just because of the time, I'm fine with it, but there's one aspect of it that I have a hard time connecting with my faith, and it makes me wonder if this faith is right or not. It's not the time that it takes. It's not the apparent randomness of it. It's the fact that death is what makes evolution go. Death is evolution's friend. Death is Christianity's enemy, according to Paul. So how do you be a Christian and process evolution? It's not easy, and I get very irritated with people who say, that's not a big problem. It's a huge problem. Anybody else feel that, or am I the only one here? This is a big, big, big problem. I think sometimes we too easily think we can sort of, as a friend of mine put it, a scientist friend, he said, pin the evolutionary tail on the evangelical donkey. You can't just do that. It takes a complete rehauling of how you think of theology, where death is something that actually works in God's favor, not against God. Mental health. I don't mind telling you, my family, we're no strangers to mental health, anxiety and panic, and depression. And here's what doesn't help. Praying really hard, right? Here's what doesn't help. Try this church. The pastor preaches really well. You just need a good sermon under your belt. Or read the Psalms. You know what helped my daughter, Liz? Again, I can talk about her because it's public and she talks about it and it's in the sin of certainty and she's fine with it. But what helped her when she was 10, when she was curled up in a ball, couldn't leave home for almost a year, and missing school, what helped her was Paxil. Not that I would recommend Paxil today, but that's what it was back in the day. And within a week, she was going to movies, she was back at school. So when mental health problems descend on my family, my first reaction is not, oh Lord, do something. It's, why don't you sit this one out, take care of ISIS, let's do that, and I'll send her to a doctor who can help her. Or you know what, I do this for a living, but just reading the Bible can be enough sometimes, you know? In the Bible, God is presented as, and by the way, just so you don't get the wrong idea, I love the Bible. I just handle it a certain way, right? But these stories that just hit you, God is up in the sky someplace, right? There is no sky up there. We live in a round thing, and anywhere is up, and my up is somebody else's down. And by the way, there's no there. It just keeps going for all practical purposes infinitely. So where is God, right? Or we have a Bible that it doesn't take you long to get into this, and this is already mentioned this morning too by Jackie, a Bible that normalizes slavery. It's just a thing. And not just on the part of the Israelites, but God gave laws to Moses on Mount Sinai about how to treat slaves. And it's not always nice. Read Exodus. Or God is transactional in the Bible, right? You know what I mean by that? It's like, okay, you obey me, you'll be blessed. You disobey me, you'll be cursed. Oh, what a wonderful God. Tell me more about this God. I can't wait to go to church and worship this God, right? It says, like, this is the way God is presented. Not everywhere in the Bible, but enough places. Like, basically, just read Deuteronomy if you haven't. Read the end of Deuteronomy and the blessings and curses to those who obey or disobey the covenant. It's not an attractive religious option for most people. And it makes you wonder, what kind of a God are we dealing with here? Or maybe the question I get more than any other from my students is, there's a lot of violence in the Bible, right? It's either God causes it or God allows it or God's doing punishing or this or that. I mean, you're reading in the Bible, you start in Genesis chapter 1. You might as well start at the beginning. Let's do this right. And you get to chapter 6, and everybody dies by drowning. It's like, there's no plan B here, Almighty Creator. It's chapter 6 of the Bible. You've already run out of patience here. I can think of several options rather than this one, but this is it? Now, I happen to love that story because I understand it very differently than something like literal history. It's very mythological, very theological, very literary, that kind of stuff. But it doesn't matter what I think because I'm a geek. It matters what normal people think. And these are barriers to faith. Just reading the Bible and watching it behave this way can be very unsettling. Or God, you know why God doesn't want the Israelites to worship other gods? Because his honor is at stake. The ancient world, and any world that we know of, apart from like maybe our culture, is an honor-shame-based society, and very much so ancient Israel, ancient Greco-Roman world in Jesus' day, which is why the crucifixion of Jesus as showing the glory of God is so ultimately counterintuitive in the ancient world. But in the Old Testament, not all the time, right? This isn't anti-Old Testament, anti-Jewish or anything, but in the Old Testament, you do have these portrayals of God where it's all about honor. And as my students say, it seems like God's really self-centered. If you besmirch my honor, this will happen. In fact, if you dishonor me, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to dishonor and shame you. And we have to ask ourselves, is that what God is really like? Good question. All I'm saying is that it's in the Bible. Just reading the Bible can cause crises of faith and doubts. Or there are laws in the Bible, right? There are laws that, I mean, some of them are great. Some of them are like, okay, you see that animal over there? You can eat that one. You see the one over there? I know it looks like that one, but you can't eat it because its hooves are different and it chews food differently. Don't eat that one. Okay, that seems rather random, but fine. Or virgin daughters are the property of their fathers, and you can kill your rebellious teenagers. These are laws given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai, as the text puts it. Or it's a God who micromanages like everything. He's like over everything, causing things to happen. God causes weather in the Old Testament. He tosses and turns, he can't do anything, and God is responsible for inflicting this on him. That's what he believes. And the psalm ends, darkness is my only friend. Talk about a psalm for the depressed. Or the next psalm. If you're not floored by that one, just keep reading in Psalm 89. It's a great long psalm where the psalmist goes on and on and on about, oh Lord, you're great. You're awesome. Your love is steadfast. You never break promises. You're like the best God ever. You don't break promises. Also, you created everything, which means you're almighty. So to reiterate, you keep your promises. You're steadfast. You're loyal to your people. You never break your promises. And you're almighty. You can pull it off. You can do anything you want to. So to repeat, you're steadfast in your promise. It goes on. It's really repetitive. It's sort of annoying. Like you've read 30 verses and they keep saying the same thing. But the psalmist is setting God up for something. He says, you keep your promises. By the way, one of your best promises, O Lord, was a promise you made to David, that you would always have somebody in the line of David sitting on your throne, on his throne. There would be an unending succession of people. And then finally you get to the punchline of the psalm, and the psalmist goes, let's talk about the exile. Not a big deal for us, a big deal for them. This was the ultimate act of God abandonment in the Old Testament. Because the Babylonians came, and they took the last king, Zedekiah, and they blinded him, but not before he killed his 3 sons, the descendants who were going to sit on the throne. They took him into captivity. No kingdom, no temple, no nothing. So, oh Lord, it sounds to us like you don't actually keep your promises. See, I love these things because you can't say this stuff in church. Actually, if you can't, you need to find another church, because there are churches where you can talk like this. And you need to be. That's the way holy people speak of God. And about side issue here, a little commercial for my own discipline of Old Testament. This is why you need the Old Testament, because you don't find this stuff in the New. And there's a reason for that. In the New Testament, everybody's expecting Jesus to come back real quick. Right? There's a triumphant thing. They have this resurrection faith. And Paul says, hold on, don't get married, do all this stuff. Jesus is coming back soon. You have this triumphalism, let's say, in the New Testament. In the Old, it's written over, I'm comfortable saying about a 1,000-year period of time. About 1200 BC to about 200 BC. It's about a 1,000-year period of time this stuff is being written down. Plenty of time to have a faith crisis. Plenty of time for the ups and downs of the geopolitical world that these people lived in. Plenty of ups and downs to have bad things happen to good people. You don't see this in the New Testament because there's no time for it. Right? That's why that's at least one of many reasons I think the Old Testament should be very key to us as we process this life of faith and this life of doubt. Well, the editors of the Bible. This sounds more boring than it is, but it's not. The Bible was compiled by human beings, probably beginning around 200 BC and going on into the Christian era. The Jews were compiling their Bible and making decisions about what stays in and out. And I love the fact that they kept all those Psalms. I love the fact that they kept Job. I love the fact that they kept Ecclesiastes. I love the fact that they kept the Book of Lamentations. They could have papered it over and given us sort of the sanitized God that many of us were raised with. They could have done that, but they didn't, because they knew, no, this is a part of our tradition. This stays. This is what we value. This explains us as journeyers, as pilgrims in this faith. And I think we lose that. We lose that when we miss the Old Testament, and we are, again, so used to having this faith of ours sanitized, and it's simple. Has it ever been simple? How do you deal with doubt? Good question. All I know is that people have been asking that question for probably 3,000 years. You're not unusual. You're not weird. You're not broken. You don't need to be fixed. You may need to be healed. You may be struggling, but that's a very different thing. So it's biblical. And one last thing I want to point out here. I'm not going to keep you too long. You probably want to eat lunch. I know I do. And Ken's going to sing a song for us at the end, probably for half an hour, right? I told him, make this one good, because the other ones were clinkers. I want a really good song for mine. He's laughing. He thought it was funny back then. Anyway. But see, here's the thing. Doubt is not only sort of a normal thing in people's lives. Not only does it have a biblical precedent, let's say, part of our inscripturated tradition is marked by these seasons of doubt, of not understanding, of struggling with faith. Not only that, but here's the thing that always gets to me, and this is a thing that probably, I don't want to exaggerate, but might have saved my Christian life years ago. It's realizing that doubt does something for us that nothing else can really do. And that's to get rid of the ego, to get rid of the sense of control that we have over God, and to take everything away. Some of you know my story. When I taught at Westminster Seminary, which is outside of Philadelphia, for a number of years, and I left, and that's a long story that is complicated, but I'm right, no matter what you hear from other people. But you see, I left, and it was a very difficult last few years for me. It was just psychologically very difficult. So when I left, people said, how you doing, Pete? I'm like, I'm doing great. I'm out of prison. You know, the shackles are off. Whatever metaphor you want to use. I started eating better. You know, I lost 20 pounds. I was exercising for the first time in a long time. I felt free, and I was so happy. And that lasted about 6 months. And I don't even know what happened, but I remember having these conversations either with God or with myself inside my head. And one of them went something like this. Okay, Pete, you left Westminster because you didn't want to be told exactly how your faith should line up. You wanted the freedom to think about stuff. You had these wonderful boundaries. You don't want those boundaries anymore. It's taken away. So now the question, Pete, is what do you believe? What do you believe if you don't have those boundaries around you, right? Like a lot of you have been in churches that have been comfortable, that have given you structure. But what if the structure doesn't mean anything to you anymore? You have to leave. Then the question is, I don't have any structure anymore. It was very easy to be a part of a Christian community where essentially I was conscripted. I was told what to believe, and I had to sign things every year to say that I actually believed them. But now that it's not there anymore, all of a sudden, the question becomes very existential. Okay, what do you believe? And my answer was, I have no idea. I have absolutely no idea what I believe. And again, I don't say this lightly. It's sort of a trendy, sexy thing to say, but atheism was a logical option for me for many months. And I remember just lying on my couch. I stayed in bed. I was depressed, right? So I was on my couch sometimes just lying there and lamenting the fact that I'll never sing a Christmas carol again, right? Or that this thing that was so a part of defining me was gone. And I was rewriting my narrative really from the ground up. And I didn't know how to do that. These were muscles I had never had to exercise before because I'd always been told. And I always thought that I was right. So here you go. So here's what happened to me. I was I had a lot of time. I had a severance, a rather long severance from Westminster because I knew where the bodies were buried. They had to do that. So I'm starting to do some writing and thinking, maybe some blogging. And I don't even know how this happened. I came across this story that I tell every chance I get because it's one of these significant God moments in my life. And it was a story, if you've heard this before, it's in the Sin of Certainty. It's about Mother Teresa. And it was a story, and I tell my students this story about how a thing that made a big difference to me was I met this great woman on the internet. Yeah, they don't think that's funny either. You didn't think it was funny, but... so anyways, it's a famous story that's been retold many times of John Kavanaugh. John Kavanaugh was a moral philosopher. He was a Jesuit at St. Louis University. He just died about maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And this was in the mid-'70s, and he went to visit Mother Teresa in Calcutta because he was having his own faith crisis, his crisis of clarity, his crisis of certainty. And he said, I'm going to take some time off from yakking all the time and just sort of hang out with Mother Teresa. She'll know what to do. So he meets her, and she says, well, how can I help you? And she says, well, you can pray for me. And she said, how can I pray for you? And she said, and he said, pray that I have clarity in my life. And she said, no, I will not do that. And he said, why, you little... No, he didn't say that, but he probably wanted it. Like, how much does plane ticket cost to come to India? You owe me one here. But no, she said, I will not do that. He goes, why not? And then she said, this is the thing that struck me and that I come back to very, very often in my life when I'm thinking through this stuff. She said, I will not do that because clarity is the last thing you are clinging to and must let go of. And I remember sitting, I was at the computer just like this and saying, oh shit, I've been doing it wrong. It made immediate sense to me, immediate sense that my problem is wanting to hold on to my control of God and the power of the ego and the power, I'm embarrassed to say, but the power of the intellect, the power of a PhD or whatever. It's just feeling like I had God. I've got a few questions, sure, but basically I've got the God thing down really, really, really well. And now I don't anymore because that structure is gone. And I knew at that moment I had to let go. So Father John Kavanaugh says to Mother Teresa, yeah, thanks for nothing. But by the way, it seems like you have a lot of clarity. And she laughed. And she said, I've never had clarity a day in my life. But what I've had is trust. So I will pray that you trust God. And that was my second oh shit moment in 5 minutes reading this because, yeah, what if this is about trusting God regardless of where we are? But it's hard to trust God. Of course it's hard to trust God. But trying that way to bypass our egos, to not filter everything through what makes sense, and to chart another path. I was in my late 40s at this point, mid-late 40s, and I reflected on how is it that I never, ever heard this once in any church that I was ever in? And I felt ripped off. They meant well. They're not bad people. I don't have any negative feelings towards churches that I've been to, but what is it about the system that many of us grew up in that doesn't have room for mystery and for not knowing? I've been getting into something, not seriously because I don't have the time, but something called apophatic theology. Is it ring a bell to anybody? Apophatic, which, people define it differently, but basically apophatic means like away from speaking, away from words. Because anytime you say something about God, you're actually not saying something true about God at the same time. Even like God is love. Well, it depends on what you mean by God. It depends on what you mean by love, and it depends on what you mean by is. We won't get into all that, but the point is that, God is love is true, but at the same time, we are loading those words with ideas we have in our head that we feel exhaust God and define God well, when the reality of God is much bigger than our words. Our words don't capture God. Boy, that's a hard thing for a teacher to accept. My words can't do it. So in the Sin of Certainty, I call this, I think of Christianity as being trans-rational. not anti-rational, not irrational, and certainly not rational, but transrational. I actually thought I was clever that I came up with that idea, but I found out later that 1.5 million people have said that already, one of whom was Richard Rohr. And by the way, Peter Holmes, the comedian, in his last book, Comedy Sex God, great title, he uses that term too. It's transrational, meaning God is beyond our rational capabilities. And for me, in terms of living with doubt, I can't tell you what that means to me. It takes the pressure off. I get to say, I have no idea. And I get these questions all the time from people like on my blog or whatever, say, well, how do you handle this or that? So I have no idea. Really? Yeah, I don't have any idea. And I'm very comfortable with not knowing how the universe works. I can't find my car keys half the time. I'm not going to be too worried about how the universe works. I can't understand my wife. I'm not going to understand God. She can't understand me either, but that's all right. Anyway, just a couple things here. I want to close with this because I know that this is an issue that a lot of people struggle with for very, very different reasons. But there's more at stake here for me as a father and now as a grandfather about this idea of doubt. It's not just us now. It's actually, what are we doing to those who come after us? And how do we serve them best? A common thing that I've heard growing up in evangelical contexts, I'm not slamming that, but just in those contexts, I always heard about, you got to be faithful to the past. But what about being faithful to the future? What about being faithful to what comes after us? What about creating cultures that accept the normalcy of the struggle of faith, where it's not just about holding down the reins tight? Now, I'm sure Brian's not here, he is a busy guy, but Brian McLaren has great language for this sort of stuff. He talks about the difference between, I think, preservationists and what he calls creatives, and I call them innovators, right? And they both need each other. See, the people who are always stuck on preserving the past, they've got a good point, because there's something that we're trying to preserve. There's a tradition. It's not we're just making stuff up on the fly. But they also even acknowledge that we're not living in the first century anymore, and times have changed, and we have to think differently. Their level of tolerance might be just very low for what they're willing to explore, but they get it. And likewise, innovative, creative types, they're asking, yeah, but what's next? That's almost prophetic sort of vision for the future. But they're doing that in order to preserve something and not just throw it away. They're doing it to make something stay. And I think to create cultures like that, beginning in our homes, and certainly in our churches, that accepts that paradoxical matching of these two ways of looking at reality, where kids come to you and they say, Mom, I'm reading this story, or Dad, I'm reading this story, and I just don't like it, and I don't even know what to do with it. And to say, yeah, I've thought about that. I don't like it either. Neither have a lot of people in the history of the church. However, you can say that to a 5-year-old, right? Or people have thought about that question for a long time. You know what? God wants you to think about that question too. There's nothing wrong with you for raising that. God loves you the way you are, and you're asking that question. Are you honest about it? Are you really curious about it? That's a good question. You can do that. And that way, giving expression to doubt that is positive and that is oriented towards spiritual formation and blessing these children as they get older, so they can maybe avoid the midlife crisis that so many people have had, like dads, we're in your 40s and you're finally thinking about this stuff for the first time, and you have to have a whole new paradigm for faith, when there's one sitting there staring us in the face all along. That's a very biblical and scriptural model. That's hard to do, because if you're in a home where you go to a church that doesn't value that, where is that going to be supported, right? That's a very, very difficult. I don't have answers to that, but that's the kind of stuff to work through. There are churches who aren't weird, though. I go to an Episcopal church. Any Episcopalians out here? Yeah, I haven't joined because nobody's getting their meat hooks in me ever again, no denomination. But I like the Episcopalians because they're not biblicistic. They're not overworked about stuff. They can ask questions and talk about things, and I think that's very, very important. All right, I'll just leave you with this. For me, the bottom line is this. Faith, as you've heard many times, is not the absence of doubt. Certainty, right, is really the opposite of faith, not doubt. And faith is not about holding on to certainty as long as you can. Faith is actually what you do when you don't have that certainty anymore. That's when the life of faith really, really comes into play. All right, folks, thank you. Blessings to all of you. It's good to be back here again. Stay cool, by which I mean temperature-wise, personality-wise too. So thank you very much.
Oh, my faith, I've lived in this house. I thought the walls were oh so strong. We saw God on the TV set. We knew what was right and what was wrong. Then one day the rain began to come down. All at once I lost a wall. What am I gonna do in this house of mine? How can I fix it after all? Somebody said put in a window right there where the wall used to be. So I put in this little window like a skylight, sure looking good to me. My mama said you should have restored the wall. We don't want windows here, no, no. Windows only let in falsehood, and that's no way for faith to grow. One by one the walls were crashing down. All those stories, doctrines, confessions, and creeds. One by one the walls come crashing down now. This house is no longer what I need. But you gotta keep out the rain somehow. Added more windows day by day. Mama was so upset with me. She said, one of these days your house will just go away. Some cool thing I have discovered. With all these windows I can see the sky. I can't even see my TV set. I turned it off and wished the damn thing goodbye. Now I'm living in a crazy kind of house. Walls are gone and windows everywhere. I don't quite know what in the world is coming next, but I kind of like living